Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Roanoke Valley Libertarians weekly conversation with different guests we've been having on, trying to, learn more about other aspects within the, if it's with how to get people to come out and vote, new voting ways, and all that good stuff. Today, we're going to be joined by Lisa Ekman. She wrote Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites. I got this book at the LNC in 2024. You said you didn't remember me, which really surprised me, But, I figured you ran into a lot of people there that day or that weekend.
I did. And then I once it clicked, then I did. I totally remembered our conversations, but I had also been to probably 10 events since then, different events for the book. And so it took me a while to think all the way back to May of 24, reaching out to you this fall. So,
right. Well, I'm glad you're able to make it here, and we'll be able to discuss a little bit about it. I thought you had a very interesting book. So we'll just start with, so you started as your career as a Democratic lobbyist and operative in Washington. And how did the early experience shape your worldview?
So my early experience, growing up, my parents were very liberal, but classical liberals. And by that, I mean they actually believed in liberty and freedom and our Constitution and instilled those values in me. And one of the things they did really is make me a free speech absolutist. And that is something that really stuck with me throughout my life and my career. And when I went to graduate school to get my master's in social work, I was pretty liberal myself. And I got nominated for a program called the Presidential Management Internship Program, designed to bring people with graduate level education into federal service. And I got recruited through that program to go to Washington. And I worked at the beginning for a political appointee at the tail end of the Clinton administration. So at the Social Security Administration, not the commissioner, but the one right below that level, which would be like right below the secretary, appointed by Bill Clinton, and worked to make federal policy more supportive of people with disabilities and to help them to go back to work if they were getting disability benefits, if they had the ability to do that. And so I, learned right away about how political appointments work in agencies, how agencies work. And because it was the very tail end of the administration, I also saw right away what happens when an administration changes and sort of how, as our current president would call it, the deep state or the people in these agencies, the bureaucrats in these agencies, can work to thwart the agenda of an incoming administration and how those things kind of happen. I also, during my time there, got the opportunity to go work in the United States Senate on a couple of details for a couple of different senators, including Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts, working on disability policy for Senator Kennedy, and then also worked at a number of nonprofits as well as government contractors, all working on either implementation of disability programs for the contractors or advocacy and lobbying on behalf of nonprofits that were representing the desires, the policy of trying to achieve a policy objectives for people with disabilities. And, throughout my time in Washington, D.C., when I got there, the environment there was really different than by the time I left, Brian. When I got there, people who were of different political parties, they actually were friends with each other. They actually would hang out with each other outside of work. And, senators would go have dinner with senators from the opposite party. And, there wasn't this sort of assumption that someone who thought differently than you was sort of evil or bad or morally inferior. I think that there is now. And I really had the sense that despite the differences people had, most of the people who were in office or who were working for them actually were having good faith conversations to try to make the country better, and that they would um, go into negotiations with that in mind, and to try to maybe get to a compromise that you didn't get everything you wanted, but you felt like you were improving things. And over the years that I was there, that really changed. And I started hearing a lot more things like, well, that might be a good idea, but I don't like the optics of it. That isn't going to look good. Or I'm not sure how the donors will, think about that. And I started to really see that change. And then I started to really see people become much more tribal almost in their identification with a party. And we started to see the rise of identity politics. We started to see people sort of, as I said, assuming the worst about each other, as opposed to this is a fellow American who may think differently than I do about some things, but let me see what we have in common and what we can work together to achieve. And so I definitely saw that changing during the time that I was there. I would say especially after people started getting in on social media and started to sort of wear their politics on their sleeves and have it become much more of their identity than it used to be, especially before I even got to Washington, growing up. And so that sort of gives you an idea of where I started, how I got there, and brings you up to maybe where I guess a few more things just so people can understand how deep in the Democratic apparatus I was. I actually went to law school while I was in Washington, and I was still working for government contractors during that time. And I was the president of the Georgetown Law Democrats, and so did a lot of work around helping get Barack Obama elected for his first term, and volunteered at his national headquarters. And just really, I used to say, and this will tell you how sort of tribal it is, that I bled blue, and that I would vote blue no matter who. So I think that makes sense. Yeah.
What I know you had like the health of your parents started your awakening, you said in your book.
Mm-hmm.
My question, what about like was there other things that were starting before that? Because like, for instance, I was in the Navy and I came from the Republican side. And at that point, I started to lose faith in them. And then, finally, when I looked at the foreign policy, when I got out of the Navy, I looked at the foreign policy, went, this is completely backwards. Was there other little things that were starting to chip at it? And then like, all right, this was the final push. What was that?
Yeah, I mean, there were all sort of little things, but I think I just pushed them back into the back of my head. I used to really I used to really think our Fourth Amendment was really, really important to protect our rights. And I remember when the Patriot Act passed, it was right after 9/11. And, um, you know, the whole thing is that a lot of our constitutional rights aren't there for when things are easy, right? The rights aren't enshrined, our God-given rights, our natural born rights are not enshrined in the Constitution for when it's easy to give people those rights. They're there for when it's hard. And obviously after 9/11, everything was really hard, but they basically were removing a lot of those steps before getting a warrant that you might need. And Edward Snowden, when he came out and told us about what they were actually doing, they were performing warrantless searches. And so I was starting to think about, wow, maybe none of these politicians really care about our constitutional rights. But I kind of had to put that in the back of my head. I had there were a couple of things that kind of bothered me. One being that when people started to sort of try to force people to put pronouns in their emails, this is, something that the left was kind of doing to their own, people in their own party. It started to get me thinking about, well, where are we going with this? If we are starting to control people's speech, where does that end, and how does that sit with the First Amendment? Because I'm really a free speech absolutist, no matter how hard that can be sometimes to just say, I would, protect your right to say something I find absolutely abhorrent. But I think what kind of also, with my parents' health, that did sort of begin to sort of create cracks in the dam that held the flood of truth back. But then there was the idea that I worked on disability policy, and during the time I was in Washington, people just kept getting sicker and sicker and more disabled. And I was fighting to get more money to help them once that happened. But our community wasn't having any conversations about, well, why are we getting sicker, and why are we not pursuing more policies to help keep people healthy instead of doing things like passing Obamacare and taking away people's rights to have a lot of choice about their health care. Why are we doing that and feeding insurance companies instead of helping people to be as healthy as possible? I think there were all sorts of things which really kind of, should have caused me, I would say, if I had a free mind, to question a lot of things. Like, for example, when we had the housing crash to the economy, why did no one go to jail for that, and why did so many people lose their homes? If you trust the government and you trust them to be doing the right thing for the people, that seems kind of backwards. And I have never been a sort of a neocon, as you would say, in terms of foreign policy, and so I did question why did we how and why did we become the world's policeman, um, and why are we going around the world um, and doing the things we do from a foreign policy perspective?
Right. Yeah, that what how is it with your friends? Because since you were around, since you were so deep into the Democrat Party, when you start having these feelings, and you're expressing them to people, you start getting shunned, or were they like, yeah, I agree with you? Because I heard there was and I wish I could say who told it. I can't remember. It was one on a podcast, but they were talking about like capital gains tax, and Obama was saying let's raise it, and behind closed doors, he's like, um, I know that lowering it would be better, but as you were talking about, it don't fit the base. How was there people in the like behind going, I don't like which way this Democrat Party's going. It's going a little bit different, or what? But we're just going to have to keep marching forward. Was that, or how do you feel with your friends?
Well, I don't really have many friends from before anymore, because of that. I think what happened is a lot of this happened sort of so slowly and incrementally. You know that meme with the frogs sitting in the pot of water and they slowly turn the heat up? I
Yeah.
think it happened sort of like that, that um, you know, it was, we're going to ask, most people are going to ask you to put your pronouns or in your email signature, or say your pronouns in your email signature. And then I think then cancel culture came around and people became pretty afraid to speak up. I think there are people who would have said to me in private about certain things, yeah, I do agree with you. But then if I would bring it up at a big meeting or something, no one would be there, to support me. And it's not that I was speaking out strongly about it either, then, because there is a strong sort of cancel culture, and there's a big, there's political correctness is how they started grabbing the minds of people with um, on the left, and political correctness slowly expanded and expanded until you couldn't really have certain opinions unless they fit with. Are you hearing an echo a little bit?
No, it was for a second, but it
Okay.
stopped now. Yeah.
Okay. So I was, but most people just go along with it because they're too afraid to get kicked out or ostracized, or that kind of thing. So I think that it's really, there aren't a lot of people speaking up, but there are people who will say things privately, but aren't willing to take on the progressive cult, as I call it.
Right. So let's see. In your book, you discuss reevaluating your political beliefs. What steps do you recommend for readers who feel stuck in their own bubbles, their own, because that's what truly we are in.
Yeah, I think the first thing that I recommend is to start being willing to ask questions and question everything. I think that's a big thing. And then the very first thing I think that is really helpful to do is get to principles. Try to say, okay, I think the government should do X. Okay, well, what basic principle am I basing that on? And then try to apply that principle in every situation, other situations, and think about, if there was a leader that I disagreed with, can I still honor that principle that my policy decision is based on? And I think when you start doing that, it gets back to, what are those fundamental principles, and am I consistent in applying them? And am I consistent in applying them in a way that I would be comfortable with if a leader who I do not agree with had that same power? I think what happened a lot on the left is that the ends started to justify the means, and those foundational principles sort of disappeared in many ways. And so if you're trying to examine your own beliefs, I think that's a really good way to start. I think another thing to do is to follow the money, and that is to say, who is paying for this? Who's benefiting from it, and where's the money going? Because I think sometimes that can really help you look at things in a different way. We are currently almost $38 trillion in debt as a country. Some people are asking that question, and I laugh about it, but they'll say, well, who do we actually owe that debt to? Obviously, we could have a whole other conversation about money, debt, the Federal Reserve. But the point in asking, the question of following the money is, I think a lot of what people are so unhappy about is the way that, putting aside whether we should be taxed and pay taxes at all, where are my tax dollars going? What are they being used for? And often people don't take the time to actually trace that. And I think when you do look at that, I think something that's come out, for example, is that a lot of what are supposed to be sort of organic protests are actually paid protests. Well, who paid for them? Why did they pay for them? Who's benefiting from it? And where did the money go? Can help you kind of re-examine, wow, are there really as many people as I thought who think like I do, who think in the same way? And then the final thing that I would suggest, so those are two things: question everything, try to get back to your foundational principles, and see if you're consistent and you can justify your policy positions based on those principles, following the money, and then allow yourself to listen to people you disagree with an open mind. And I think that that is a hard one sometimes for a lot of people to do, um, especially if that person is not what uh, the establishment would call an expert. If it's not a person who has the degree or the credentials. And I think that's, getting past that, that piece is really important if you want to look at things in an objective way, because a lot of times the people who have those degrees and credentials will never be able to tell you the truth because it would undermine their authority, so to speak. So those are the things that I would suggest if you're starting to think about in any way, am I right about things, and want to re-examine what your beliefs are, is to start by questioning everything, looking at your foundational principles, and working to policy positions, follow the money, and listen to people you disagree with an open mind.
Right. That sounds good. You also talk about like what you were just saying. So you want to choose your instinct, trust your instincts over party lines. Can you share something where, let's see, can you share a story from the book where ignoring this led to a regret? What's something that do you regret where you're like, but hey, it's blue no matter. I can tell you multiple regrets I have. I voted for John Warner when he was not the candidate I liked, but we can't let Mark Warner in. This was back in '96, And what do you got there?
Well, I mean, I think I could say without a doubt that um, working to get Barack Obama elected is a regret of mine. I think that he was supposed to be uniting us, but I think he divided us in many ways. I think that his push to get everyone to go to college has created a disaster for us in student loan debt, and a lot of children, young adults being convinced that they could never succeed if they did not go to college, and now have a college degree that is pretty useless. Um, and I don't say that lightly. I spent 9 years in post high school education of my life, but I think when I graduated college, having a bachelor's degree meant something very different than when a young person graduates from college with a bachelor's degree now. And I saw that in November, I think it was November statistics, that the unemployment rate for 19 to 24-year-olds with a college degree is almost 10%. And so I think that that was a huge disaster, and I worked really hard to get Obamacare passed, and I have a big regret about that, especially as we see how things have happened since then and what it's done. It should be called the Unaffordable Care Act, I think, at this point, as opposed to the Affordable Care Act.
At that time you were pushing it, did you know what you were pushing, or did you believe in what it was saying?
I believed in a lot of parts of it. I really thought that in order, the one caveat to that is I thought that in order to create some competition, we should have had a public option that people could buy into, which I'm not sure I believe now. But what I did believe, I will say that there were all sorts of things with health insurance that were terrible back then. They had a policy. Many insurance companies had policies, or a policy called rescission, which is they basically take your health insurance away because you got sick. They rescinded your policy, or lifetime limits on coverage, or limits on coverage for certain conditions. And so there were a lot of things that needed to be addressed. But at the time, I really believed that we needed to do something to get everybody health insurance. And now I very much regret having helped to pass that.
Yeah, I just saw Mark Warner. He's saying that we need to have universal health care first, and then we can discuss how we're going to lower costs. And to me, it just seems backwards, the logic there, because free market is the route that I would prefer to see go. But it almost seems like when you have this government control, they can control you a lot easier if they can control your health care, And I don't think we get good health care with government ran health care, if you see in multiple countries and things. Now, at the same time, but you got to remove regulations and things of that nature to help bring down the costs. But now, do you do anything politically now? Or are you still part of, or what's your politics? Are you leaning into the Republicans, helping them? Do you help independents, or where do you go?
I would consider myself pretty politically homeless. I think I may have mentioned to you when we were talking, I have a lot of sort of libertarian leaning ideals. I believe in freedom. And, I really felt like I do vote, and I did in this last election vote for Donald Trump because, in my opinion, I was looking for who is going to protect my most basic fundamental rights, and specifically freedom of speech. I can't say that I'm 100% happy with what's been happening there in the freedom of speech area in this administration, but that was why I did. And I don't think I like, so I'm sort of leaning towards the Republicans because of that. I'm not, like I say, I have a lot of things that I am not too happy about that the president has been doing. I'm not politically active in, like, I didn't work for anybody's campaign or anything like that. I pay attention and I vote, and I do reach out to my congressman from time to time. I have reached out to my senators, but they're not going to really listen to me much, given their politics. I don't think here in Virginia. I guess I would say I lean. I would consider myself sort of in the middle. I'm kind of conservative in that I want to conserve the Constitution and protect those natural born rights that are enshrined in it. And so that leaves me leaning towards Republicans versus Democrats. Overall, I think those two political parties are way too powerful. And I would love to see something that reforms that and takes some of the power away from those parties, because I think they distort the process completely.
No, I totally agree with you. So, and I know your book was Deprogramming Democrats, but what are some of the biggest flaws you see within both parties when it comes to economic policy or social justice?
So I think, yeah, and I wrote the book Deprogramming Democrats because I came from that side. I think there are people just as brainwashed on the right, especially any of the neocons who sort of follow that approach. I would like to see us get way back to sort of I believe both sides completely distort the free market, okay, economically. I would like to see much less regulation, much less interference from the federal government in our day-to-day lives. And I'll use this as an example. It's one that I use quite often. But for example, if I want to buy and drink raw milk, I don't think the federal government should have any say in whether or not I, as a grown human, can, from the farmer down the road, buy some milk from him and hold him accountable if that milk is not good. The way with all the regulations, with all of the inspections and everything else, I don't get to have that say, and I have no ability to hold some huge dairy producer who is halfway across the country accountable if for the conditions of their farm. So I think the federal government, both parties sort of way over regulate. The Republicans try to deregulate, but they interfere in the market just as much by giving corporate welfare and by all the regulations. So I'd like to see a much freer market, and I think both parties do a lot to distort that. When it comes to social justice, I believe in inequality, and I believe in equality of opportunity. And I think that, the Democrats have gone way too far in manipulating things to try to get equity or equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. I believe in a meritocracy. I understand that. I use this example. I'm 5'3". I am never going to be a WNBA player. That doesn't mean it's unjust or we live in an unfair society that at 5'3" I can't play basketball professionally. And I use that as an example that we're all born with different talents, abilities, skills, and that our success in certain areas are going to be related to those talents, skills, and abilities. And so, aside from removing any legal discrimination and barriers that are put in place through law, I don't think it's the government's job to try to ensure equal outcomes for people. And I think we end up with worse outcomes for everyone when we try to do that.
Right. I thought it was interesting when you talked about political correctness laid the groundwork for equity over equality. Can you explain a little bit about that? Because then it goes to talk about there was no definition for equity. And, that's a big hot topic right now. DEI and all that good stuff.
Yeah. So, I think we can all understand what equality is, right? We all know we have an equal chance. That there are no legal impediments that create an uneven playing field. With equity, and as you say in the book, I talk about this a lot, and I think I listed 8 definitions maybe of equity, and they're all different and they're all subjective. What does equity mean? What does it mean to be equitable? And part of the challenge is that if we all agree that we don't have equity right now, how do we get from where we are to whatever someone says is an equitable solution? So, for example, you almost would definitely have to take resources from one person and give them to another in order to create equity. Or what you might have to do is to say that, like I said, give something to someone else, or prevent someone from having the same opportunity that another person might have in order to create equity. And because equity can never be defined, we also can never reach it. So no matter how much we give, we would never be in an equitable situation. And then the question always becomes, when you're trying to force us down a path, who gets to define what is equitable? Right. And I think that is part of of the question. And so, I think it really becomes clear to me that we live in a constitutional republic based on individual liberty and freedom, which is a very unique situation in the history of the world. A equitable society and a society based on individual liberty and freedom are not compatible, because in a in an equitable, quote unquote, society, you're trying to achieve equality of outcome. And that necessarily means that you are not a meritocracy. People do not get outcomes based on what they put into it and their abilities and skills. And so, and we sort of changed from the goal of equality to the goal of equity without a public conversation about it that I'm aware of. It just sort of came out of nowhere. I guess it sort of came out of the Obama years, the Obama administration. We started to see it really growing around then. And then it really, really took off after COVID started and George Floyd, I think, and the BLM movement. We saw it really take off.
Oh, yeah. What role do you think social media and big tech has played with with the elite-driven ideologues and individuals? You know, how much do you think it's more powerful now than mainstream media?
I definitely do think that social media and independent journalists are becoming way more powerful than the mainstream media. I think you're seeing mainstream media's viewership plunge, and I think people are not trusting mainstream news sources because they are so I think you can so easily verify what they're saying and not saying, and you can see bias very easily when you look at their reporting on things. And I think that, part of what happened is in my lifetime, we went from a time when we didn't have a 24-hour news cycle. We had our local newspaper and maybe 3 television stations that all went off the air at midnight. And that was how you could get your news. That was pretty much it. To now, where obviously you have you at the tip of your fingers hundreds and thousands of news sources that you can turn to. And it's really easy in real time to sort of show that the mainstream media is giving you a biased account or not an account at all. And the younger generations, they don't, many of them don't have a TV. They don't, have a cable subscription. They stream everything. They watch podcasts to get information. And it's just become really clear that the mainstream or legacy media is not giving you unbiased, real information. And I think they're struggling, rightfully so, as a result.
Right. Because I think about it, and I agree with what you just said, because the internet, podcasts, YouTube, things like that are having so much more, being more effective getting out the message than the mainstream media. But I'm 50, so then it seemed like everything that happened was a conspiracy. We saw Charlie Kirk get shot, and now it's like everything. It's conspiracy. Oh, it wasn't that one guy who's been accused. That's the only bad thing about the internet. It's almost too much, and you can't just. And it's almost like what is it? Putting magnets near bees or whatever, and it gets our brain all fried, and we all start getting more spun up. So you got the politicians doing their thing, spinning you up. You got the news media spinning you up, and then we don't know what's going on. We don't know what's left or right. We're going all crazy. That's the real wild thing about it.
Yeah, I mean, it is really wild. And even, throwing in their AI, and half the time you can't even tell if what you're looking at is real, right? And I think one of the things that I always try to do is sort of take a step back and try to get my brain to shut down a little bit so that I can listen to my gut, like, does this seem real? And then again, what I always try to do is follow the money, and I think that if you do take a step back and think about that, it often helps. Sometimes, who's making money off this? How are they making money? Was there a money issue at play? Because like I think that there are a lot of people doing nefarious things, and there are a lot of people like, the term conspiracy theorist was uh, was coined by the CIA, trying to discredit people who were questioning the JFK assassination. And that's where it came from, to say that if you were saying it wasn't the official story wasn't true, then you were a conspiracy theorist and it was meant to discredit you. And I just, I raise that because we now have had the release of the JFK files, and it's really clear that the official story we were given was not true. And so, and I think, so there are a lot of actual conspiracies that happen. And I guess, my motto is question everything. And when people don't want to answer questions about something, and being a recovering attorney, that's what I call myself because I don't practice anymore, but being a recovering attorney, I recognize that when you have an ongoing investigation, or you have a legal case that you are pursuing, there are certain things that you will not reveal. But if you do not answer any questions, it's going to raise suspicion, right? And so transparency, to the extent that it can happen, is your best way, I think, to limit the conspiracy theories that the buzz that you were talking about, the brain buzzing and all the questions. But I don't think we're wrong ever in asking questions. And if someone answers them, that usually can end the controversy if there is nothing nefarious going on. A lot of times, I think when people don't answer, is when and aren't being transparent and clear, is when you have that kind of buzz going on. And again, I think it's a lot of it is trust your gut. Like, does what someone is saying pass your gut check? And if it doesn't, don't listen to it.
Do you feel that how much do you think the government wants to keep people on edge? Because, for instance, we can go back to 9/11, and the Pentagon is surrounded by a whole bunch of cameras. It's not like they've got one ring doorbell on there, and they should easily be able to show you the plane hitting, and all it is like real quick clips. And it almost makes it even like when they release things like that, or if it's the Epstein in jail, everything. Do you think they do that purposefully, or do you think that there's just incompetence? I mean, when you were working up there, what do you think of that? I mean, I don't know what the point would be. Like, like you just show us the video and it's over.
I agree with you. Like, I also would ask that same question for January 6th of 2021. Yeah, I mean, I think that if you are hiding, if you have nothing to hide as the government, and again, I will grant you redactions for national security. I'll grant you redactions for ongoing investigations, all of those things. But it is only going to continue to raise suspicions when you hide these things. And so either you actually have something that you're hiding, or you are trying to create controversy. I don't understand. Like, I don't think it's incompetence. I mean, I'll throw this one out there too. It's like, I know that there are cameras everywhere in DC, everywhere, So why did it take so long to identify supposedly the January 6th pipe bomber?
Right.
Um, yeah, I mean, they were arresting people for not even entering the Capitol, but being on Capitol grounds, and could identify all of them. But they couldn't identify this one person who was by themselves, supposedly. And it just raises suspicions when things like that happen, right? And I think that, I mean, one of two things is true. Either their surveillance is actually really terrible, or they are not releasing things on purpose. And I can't tell you why they would do that. It always leads me to question, what is it that they're hiding? That's what I would always ask. So
Because usually when they release something, something bigger is going on. Look at this hand while we do something really bad with this hand, or vice versa. Um,
indeed.
have you received any feedback from anybody, any Democrats who started questioning their own? Have you ever talked to anybody like that? Who won't go
Yeah.
like, hey, let's break away from the system.
Yeah, I mean, I have. I've met a lot of people who were sort of already in the awakening process, and I've talked to them. And then I've also, talked to a lot of people who were already awake, and some that were not. I mean, the thing about it is about the awakening and sort of opening your eyes is that you can't lead anybody to it. They have to do it themselves. You can help them, and I do have suggestions in the book about how you might be able to do that. But I've had a lot of people some of the things that I wrote about in the book were very shocking to them. I think for people who are already awake who read the book, it's not as much of a aha moment, but for someone who has been brainwashed or in the cult, as I call it, it can be quite eye-opening. It's really hard when you go through this, because you at first think you're kind of losing your mind. You think like you're going crazy because everything you believe isn't true. And I think I've been able to help a lot of people sort of, I don't know about a lot. I've been able to definitely help people walk through it. I couldn't put a number on it, how many I have, but there was a podcaster who sort of considered himself leaning Democrat, and but he had me on the podcast, and then he got a copy of my book and he read it, and he said, yeah, I've really changed my views now, and I'm trying to really figure out how I feel about everything after reading the book. So I think it can be helpful to people, but they have to be open-minded about it. If they're not, they'll read the book and just think I'm gaslighting and propagandizing them, I think.
Right. Well, you got to be like Johnny Appleseed. You don't know what's going to stick, but you just got to keep throwing them seeds everywhere, and eventually something's going to pick up and grow. Because when we work tables here in Roanoke, um, candidates or whatever, like we have the world's smallest political quiz. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a Nolan quiz, and it's like 10 questions, but it's so broad. Each question you could really spend a whole day discussing, but it might be Social Security or foreign aid, or right of free speech, things of that nature. But so many times voters never even think about it. So you just got to get the message out there, and then eventually it just takes one person to hear that. What looking ahead? What do you have more books planned? Do you have anything to write another book about this, or?
Maybe. I have a few thoughts, but I will say, thank you so much for buying my book and reading it. I've kind of come to see that a lot of the people I might be trying to reach don't read books much anymore, to be honest. So I'm really trying to think through what the best way to approach it is. I think one of the things that I've been toying around with is a book about the impact of feminism, and I think it's been really, really negative, to be honest. I've turned in my feminist card, as I say, and what, and so I've thought about writing something about that. I've thought about a number of different things, and right now, I don't have another book in the works, but if I did, that it would probably be along those lines. I'm also trying to maybe get my book to do an audio version of it, so
Right.
that it could be more accessible to a wider audience that may not sit down and read a it's not that long. It's only about 200 pages.
Right.
But for a lot of people these days, I think that is pretty long, to be honest.
Which one surprised you more? Turning in your feminist card or leaving the Democratic Party? Which one? I was expecting that to happen.
That's a hard question, but I think probably the feminist card. I think maybe that was, because, I made a lot of choices in my life based on some of the things that the feminist movement, I decided I don't have children, biological children of my own, and I decided not to have children to pursue my career. And like 90% of the women over 50 who made that choice, I regret it. And now I'm at a point where I can't have biological children of my own. So, that was a tough pill to swallow. I don't know if it's surprised me more. I think maybe it did surprise me more because that didn't happen right when I woke up. And after I woke up and my entire worldview changed and all of that, I thought, wow, at least now I can, understand myself and all of that. And as I started to think through things more and see, I think especially as I look at what is happening with young women and the relationships between, or the lack thereof, to be quite honest, between young men and women, and young men who are not dating and not having sex, and they're not, doing all of that. It became really obvious to me that as feminism has evolved, it has gone in a really, really negative direction. And so that might have been more challenging and surprising than the Democrats. But I will say that you almost can't be a Democrat these days without being a feminist.
Right.
So
Huh. Interesting. All right. Yeah, that was what. And then final question. I guess what I would ask is, if you could advise. I was going to say if you could advise your younger self, but just advising if you could reach someone right now going into DC politics, what would be your key warnings and loyalty would you give? What loyalty, like party loyalty would you give? What type of suggestions would you give to someone's just starting out?
oh goodness, that's a hard one. I think it's really, really broken. Our system is really broken on purpose. And so I would encourage them to think really hard about what those foundational principles they have are, and to be strong and stick to them, and be willing to defend those principles even if they buck your party. Um, don't lose yourself. Don't let yourself get lost in the lights and the power and the money and the drama of DC. Know who you are and stay who you are, and be willing to speak up to defend the principles you believe in.
Excellent. All right, my friend. We've hit the 55-minute mark. I think we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much for coming on. If you're listening to this, please go to deprogrammingdemocrats.com. That's where you can buy the book. I know you can get it on Amazon and all that good stuff. So once again, thank you for taking the time and talking to us. So until next time, I guess we will see you later. Have a good night.